All right. Hello again, everybody, and welcome to tonight's lecture. Our topic tonight is Aztec scribal arts, and tonight's lecture is going to be part of the new Huapahua Period America lecture series. So this is a new monthly lecture series to promote the study of North, South, and Central American cultures within SCA period. My name is Isma. I'm the coordinator for the series, and of course, tonight we are going to be instructed by Lord Kallinikos. This lecture series is a continuation of the Huapahua New World Symposiums, which started during the pandemic, and we continued them yearly for a little while. Over our lifetime, we hosted 40 different instructors and more than 700 students from every single kingdom in the known world. So we're really happy to get back into sharing some of the research and some of the projects by our instructors now. So just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. So firstly, of course, this lecture is being recorded. You all heard the alert go off. So we ask that either you raise your hand and wait for the instructor to call on you, or leave any comments or questions that you have in the chat and he'll address those in time. So this is going to keep the recording nice and clean for those who aren't able to join us tonight. Secondly, in joining our lecture and any of the Huapahua lectures, you are agreeing to our zero tolerance policy for racism, xenophobia, colorism, and any other form of discrimination. If you have an issue or concern about any of the attendees to our series, I hope that you would feel safe in reaching out to me. I will get my email address in the chat after I finish talking. And thirdly, we are still looking for instructors for some of our upcoming months. So if you have a topic that you would like to teach that focuses and centers North, South, and Central America during SCA period, just reach out to me. Again, that email address will be in the chat. We can be really flexible with your time and availability. So again, thank you all again for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to our wonderful instructor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending. I am Kallinikos Gavras, and I will be your teacher. So I just shared my screen. Can everyone see it okay?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, and I will have the chat running on my second monitor. So if you have any, like I said, if you post any questions, I should be able to see them. So today's class is how to scribe like an Aztec. And so what we're going to be talking about a lot in this class are the codices. So these were the main literary source that we have for the Mexica or Nahuatl speaking people. We have them for other Mesoamerican groups as well, but I will be talking about Nahua speaking people today because that is what I've studied. So these manuscripts, most of the ones we have that survived were either made right before or right after the Spanish conquest. And of course, we do not have nearly as many extants as we wish we did. There's about 24 that exist. Most of them are in various collections and museums throughout Europe. There's some in Austria. There's a couple in England. I believe there's some in Spain. Now, there have been some that have been returned to Mexico, but of course not nearly enough. And so these were usually written on a mat or a mate, which is bark paper made from various ficus trees, and they were accordion folded, as you can see here. And so this is an example of one. This is the Codex Borbonicus, and we will be talking a lot more about these amazing, amazing books. Now, we actually see a marked change in them before and after the Spanish conquest. Before the Spanish conquest, most of them are written in this very circular style, very, like I said, with a lot of repeating, very impressionistic, not really meant to be read in the way that we're used to in European-derived cultures. You can see here in the Codex Borgia and the Codex Bortuni just how circular everything is. Of course, afterwards, we can see there was a lot more influence from European sources, from European artwork, very synchronistic. But we do still see, for instance, this symbol right here, these up here. We see that the glyphic writing system that the Aztecs used survived this transition, at least for a while, and were used alongside their more Europeanized art styles. So we have these amazingly hybrid sources like the Florentine Codex or the History of Tlaxcala. And the nice thing is, we know what these say. Uh, we know how to read these pictorial sources mostly because of something called glossing. That was Latin script notes that were added to the codices by bilingual scribes, and they just explain what everything means and they give us a nice and easy way to read it. So we are extremely fortunate that we did not really have to, you know, obviously it took some work to reconstruct how Aztec writing worked, but we have a lot of help from these bilingual scribes. And of course, we believe they did these so that both the Spanish speakers and Nahuatl speakers could read these records. So, as I've mentioned, these sources mostly use glyphic writing, sometimes called hieroglyphs. Now, we believe that glyphic writing is one of the oldest forms, if not the oldest form of writing. That's just using a picture to represent a concept. So, for this sign, we have a Quran in old oracle bone Chinese. We have Iwi, which in Egyptian, in Egyptian hieroglyphs. This is the sign for dog Isquintli in Nahuatl. And of course, nowadays we just draw a picture of a dog. So even today, we still use this kind of information conveyance. Maybe not all the time, maybe not for everything, but it is the most enduring form of pictorial representation in history. So the nice thing about Aztec glyphs is that you can look at it and get a pretty good idea about what it means. So, for instance, this one here on the top left, does anybody want to take a guess in the chat, uh, or if you want to unmute, what this one is, what this represents? So, uh, so this represents rabbit, or sorry, this represents deer, mazak, and you can look at it and say, yeah, that's a deer. This one right here, yolot, is a heart. And you look at it, and that's still a pretty good representation of a human heart. Honestly, it's more representative than the, heart that we were used to. Okay, does anybody want to guess what this glyph represents? This represents butt. This is the Aztec glyphic sign for butt. And we see this used for a few other things symbolically, but mostly it represents, buttocks or, back end. Similarly, water, we have flows of water and some little shells and splashes to dress it up a little bit. For tepet or hill, we have a hill. And even looking at it again, you can say, yeah, that's a hill. This one right here is a little bit more complicated. This represents half, and it looks like a tortilla that's been folded in half. The Nahuatl word for a folded in half tortilla was tlaco. And you can probably guess what modern English word that we have derived from tlaco. Similarly, this fancy little gold coin represents gold. So again, it is very easy, at least usually, to take a look at something and figure out roughly what it is supposed to mean. You don't really need to know the Nahuatl to get a basic idea of the semantic meaning. Sometimes they can be a little bit more abstract. The skull represents death. Again, a very common usage worldwide. This house on fire represents like conquest or sacking of a city. The shield and war club represents war. And now, of course, this is one of my favorite ones. This came from a place that meant whose name meant place of happy people, and you see a guy excitedly splashing around in the water. Um, and sometimes you do need to know a little bit more about Aztec culture. This one showing hair being cut represents a thief. because that is how they would punish thieves, among other ways, was by shaving their heads down. And this one of a lady crying represents a war captive. So again, even when they get a little bit more abstract, you can usually get what the glyph is trying to represent. So as I said, symbols generally stand for what they represent, or sometimes they are used for their syllabic value. We see this later on during the height of the Aztec Empire and during the Spanish conquest. And some of the ways that things get fun is you can see you can modify the glyph with other glyphs to make a more complicated meaning. So this one goes kwa, which means vulture. Well, the Nahuatl word for vulture literally means necklaced eagle. Don't know why that's a necklace. I need to change that. So necklaced eagle, and you have an eagle wearing a necklace. Now, glyphs can be written in any direction, left to right, up, down. We often see more complicated things written back and forth. I think the word is Bostrudian or some fancy word like that. So, left, right, left, right. Direction isn't really that important as long as you can look at it and figure out about what it's saying. Yes, Elliot, you have a question?
So going back to the thieves,
Yeah,
I assume then that hair was very important for them.
absolutely.
Okay.
So, for instance, we see the Aztec man here. We see that he has what's supposed to represent fairly long, usually about shoulder length or so hair. Women would have even longer and more extravagant hairdos that once they were married, they'd often wear up. So hair was important both socially, spiritually. It had, and so having your head shaved was a very big dishonor.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yep,
Thank you.
no problem. So yes, as we were saying, necklaced eagle, vulture. Now, one very fascinating and almost unique thing in the Aztec writing system is that since this was a primarily drawn language, you could use color to show color. So, for instance, we have this glyph that meant place of, I believe this meant place of yellow paper, and we have yellow paper. We have this symbol which represents place. I'll get to that in a moment. We have place of red water. You have red water. White hill, white hill. Um, it is a nice benefit of the language that you can use color freely to show things, while writing. And of course, you could show color as its own element, or you could just change the color of the underlying glyph. We do sometimes see just like a yellow circle to represent yellow, or like a white circle or something like that. All right, everyone with me so far?
Yes.
Hmm,
Can we
I'm
go back
glad.
to the colors, please?
Yeah. Well,
Um, what was the variety of the colors? How many did they have?
that is a very good question. Now, are you asking linguistically or what color pigments do they have access to?
Yes.
Um, I would say linguistically, they seem to have had most of the major colors that societies develop. You know, white, red, black, blue, green, yellow, purple. Um, and of course, you'd always just describe something as, the same color as a achiote ball, which was a spice ball. And I have an entire segment on pigments, so we will get to that later in the chat.
Thank you.
Yep. So E asked in a chat if the symbol for rabbit would be similar to the one for deer. And yes, actually, not exactly the same, but So here is the glyph for rabbit. Now, sometimes you would see the entire rabbit, and sometimes you would just draw the head, depending on what was more convenient for what you were doing. If you're doing a place name, it's not uncommon to see the entire animal. If you're doing like a person's name and space is tight, you may just see the head. But the glyph for rabbit was a rabbit. Exactly, like abbreviating a word. Any further questions before we go on? So we're going to get to everyone's favorite thing, numbers. So Nahuatl was or is a base 20 system. So, you don't start repeating numbers until you get to 20. And this of course reflected in their writing system. So for any number under 20, you would just draw that many circles. Sometimes you see a bar for 5 to abbreviate to save space a little bit, but that's more common in Mayan and not that common in Nahuatl. So usually you would draw circles. For 20, you would use a flag. 400, you would use a feather, with the idea being that it was as numerous as the hairs on a feather. Or yeah, for 400, because 20, that's 20 times 20, or 20 to the second power. And 20 to the third power, 8,000, was marked with a bag of cocoa beans, because that was just the biggest number of things they could think of, I think. A lot of little beans in there. Yep. And so, next category is we have how personal names were written. So names were often, almost always had meaning, and a direct semantic meaning, in the way that somebody today named Willow is named after a tree, or somebody named, you know, Cliff is named after a geographic feature. These names were almost never abstract in the way that most of our modern names are today. So, my modern name Nicholas is, comes from three different layers from Greek, and means, beautiful, means victory of the people. No, their names meant something, though they could often be quite poetic. So here's the names of some of the Aztec kings. So we have Ilhuicamina, which meant he shoots arrows into the heaven. And for his sign, we have an arrow shot into this glyph that represents heaven. So quite literally, you draw what the name means. Uh, Cuauhtemoc, he descends like an eagle. They took an eagle and showed it so it was going down. We see a lot of these phrasal names like this, by the way, in for high status people, kings, lords, things like that. But they're not. But I have seen them for just common peasants. So don't think this is purely a class locked thing. And also, I do teach an entire other class on Aztec names and heraldry, which will be in the notes that I'll provide with this class. Another one we have in my personal favorite name glyph, Itzcoatl, obsidian snake. You see, it's a snake with obsidian spines on it. Mok, Moctezuma, also known in English as Montezuma. I assume most of you have heard of him. His name means he is angry like a lord, or I've seen translated as he is full of lordly anger. Now, they didn't really have a good sign for angry, but we see he has a crown and a royal lip plug to show that he is lordly. Or Chimalpopoca, smoking shield. It's a shield with smoke coming off of it. So again, names are usually, for Nahuatl names, they would just draw what the name means. And that was a very efficient way of getting the point across. Any questions before I go on? Fantastic. So for city names, they work pretty similar. So in Nahuatl, the word for city is Altepetl, which means water and earth. At means water, and Tepetl means earth. So your water and your earth. It's again very poetic way to refer to the place you live. And these were really city states, almost like what we think of for ancient Greece. Sure, they had a surrounding hinterland and they could subjugate other cities, but your city was your main form of identification and your main form of allegiance. And they were once again also had very literal names, but names that could also be evocative of the location or history, and of course they could change over time. And each city had its own tlatoani, or hereditary chief, which the great chief ruled over. And as time goes on, war becoming closer and closer, stitched together before the Spanish invaded, of course. Now, one of the things that they had to figure out is how to show that you were talking about a place name. Because if I just drew a rabbit, that could be a rabbit. It could be a guy named Rabbit. It could be a place called Place of Rabbits. So there were a couple ways they showed this, and these were based on like similar sounds. So the word for at the place, so at the place of snakes would be Zintli. And this also sounded like the word for buttocks. As I mentioned previously, this is a very important glyph. So this is not a horrifying snake butt monster, though it does look like it. This means this is Coatzin. Yeah, this is Coatzin, place of the snakes. Or okay, looking through this, there's a few small things I have to change, but this is the sign for Mazatlan, which is still still a town in Mexico today. And we have Mazat, deer, and Tlantli, which mean and tan, which means teeth. So we have Mazatlan. This is also not a horrifying deer tooth monster. So though it haunts your nightmares, I do understand. Um, Sometimes we see ish used, which means like eye, face, or in front of. Though in that case, it's more of a direct reference than just sounds alike. And they will draw this Pokeball-looking thing for eye or face. So this is place in front of the trees. And finally, place like there's a place named Pan in Mexico. That meant canal because water was incredibly important, or place in front of the canal. So this is the canal in front of I think mango trees this one was. But you see, they combined the glyphs together, and while this represents, the descriptor, this represents the, place of. And I know this can get a bit weird, but you know, some more examples. We have Achiotlan, place of achiote spice. Coatepec, Snake Hill, not a place I would want to live, but happens. Um, and of course, sometimes they got creative. Sometimes there wasn't a direct like place indicator, like Sinkozkak, corncob necklace, or sometimes they even got creative. Like this is the twisted place, Colhuatzinco. So we have a hill that is literally twisted like some sort of Junji Ito type spiral. And then we have the butt glyph, which we've talked about. Any questions before we go on? Fantastic. I'm doing such a good job explaining everything. So I've mentioned numbers, and that leads us to dates. So the Aztec calendar was complicated. It is not like the, 28 to 31 day calendar you're used to with month names that don't really mean anything unless you're speaking Old Latin. They had every day had a sign and a number. So for instance, 1 rabbit, 12 house, and you just draw that sign and that many dots to show what day you were talking about. And usually the date they used was based on something called the Tonal Poali. This was a 240-day ritual calendar. It had 20 different symbols and 13 numbers that continued in a complicated pattern. And this wasn't just a calendar, this was considered an incredibly important part of your life. This was considered kind of like the zodiac, but more important. The day you were born on and then the day that things happened was considered incredibly auspicious or inauspicious, depending on what day on the tonal poali it fell on. Um, so again, now there was also a 365-day calendar that was distinct, and sometimes those calendars would line up, and it was a very big deal when they did. Like a very important holiday when they did. But for the most part, they had two calendars that didn't really line up much and didn't really have much to do with each other. One for boring practical things and one for much more important ritual and spiritual things. And even today, you can go and look up what today's date is on the Aztec calendar. At least there's one or two guesses on how to translate between the modern Gregorian calendar and the Aztec one. There's a website for that in my notes as well. So, of course, now we get into how we put glyphs together. So there is something known as a rebus. Now, this is something that we still use in our culture, though mostly for fun, as a little puzzle or riddle. So, I love you. I love you. Very sweet, right? To be or not to be. Or, you know, the city of Milwaukee. Like I said, we still use rebuses today, mostly for fun or for, you know, puzzles or to challenge people. And they have a long-standing place in the European tradition. I mean, of course, you have things like hieroglyphs, which were also often written in rebuses, but they're also a source of, fun and, either to hide things or to dress things up or to add clever wordplay in the European tradition. So, here is Giovanni Battista Polanto. He was an Italian writer, and in period, and again, we see that this is full of rebuses to sort of challenge the reader and kind of get them thinking. Aztec writing used rebuses very heavily. So here's a sign that I showed earlier. This is the place of Amacostlan. And so we have water, paper, yellow paper at that, and teeth. So now this one we read from the bottom up. We have the A for water. Now, paper is also ama for amat. And so the water serves as what's called a reinforcing glyph. It tells you that starts with an A sound if you're not sure. And that is a, nice little way to reinforce the meaning because we are looking at a bit of a puzzle here. So we have ama, gostik is yellow, so amako tlan with the teeth. This is amakostlan. And it's it's not actually that hard to read once you get used to it and you know what you're looking at. And plus context will usually make it clear. We also have to remember that these were written by people who knew what Amakostlan was. So, this is Milwaukee because Milwaukee is a city we all know of. So we are definitely missing that context that the Aztecs had when they're reading their own writing, though we can usually figure it out with some work. Any questions before we go on? I am nailing this. So, so often, and again, we see this. Oh, yes. Have the dyes colors used for the glyphs faded or changed over time? If so, has that made translating more tricky? That's a good question. And in my experience, not as much as you would think. So first of all, because this was written on paper, having the entire paper deteriorate, I think, is more of a worry than just the dyes. And partially, a lot of the dyes that the Aztecs used were surprisingly color fast. For instance, the color commonly called Maya blue is considered one of the most color fast pre-modern colors to exist. It is just famously resistant to fading. Also, these books were often hidden away or, in a temple or a library. So they did not get a lot of sunlight. And so they've also remained fairly easy to read. Not to mention, with the use of all the glossing, usually we know what they say, even if, they have faded for a bit. And there are some that have, especially ones that were just written in black and white. Uh, we will have a section on dyes and pigments, don't you worry. So once the Aztecs expanded into non-Nahua speaking places, and then after the Spanish conquest, we see increasingly glyphs were used to make syllabaries. So a syllabary is like an alphabet, but instead of um, each symbol representing a individual sound, like a, b, s, d, e, f, they represented a syllable. So, for instance, the name Kallinikos would be written as Ka, Li, Ni, Ko, as each one of those being its own letter. Now, there are still plenty of syllabary languages today. Um, they are not that uncommon, especially in parts of Asia and Africa. And famously, I believe Korean is a syllabary, or at least something similar to one. Now, these could be the symbols used by Nawat could be consonant verb. I mean, I'm sorry, consonant vowel consonant, or even consonant vowel consonant vowel. So they could represent what we would consider between 2 to 4 letters. And these could be formed usually from the beginning of a word, but sometimes from the middle or the end. Once again, we do have to remember that these were people who spoke Nahuatl and were able to figure out what they were looking at much easier than those of us who don't. Um, though we also see once the Spanish came in, we see that they had no problem using Spanish words as for this syllabary value either. Now, for names that weren't easily written in Nahuatl, this is where we really see a lot of syllabary use. So this name, Tepetla Ostok, we have 5 different signs going together to make the name. We have lips and the color black and the symbol for beans and the symbol for jugs and the symbol for pulque, which is a alcoholic drink common in Mexico. Um, so, te, pal, y, co. It doesn't line up always exactly, but, you know, this was very much a creative form of language construction. So you can see also how it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because they were, combining things together in a way that made sense to them to read. So, as I said earlier, order doesn't really matter as long as it's clear the order they go in. And in this one, I think the line starting at this mouth symbol is a pretty good indicator of that. All right, I know the syllable stuff is confusing. Does anybody have any questions about that before I go on?
Um, was
Yeah,
this for everybody? How common was it for people to read and to be able to master this? Or
that's a great question. I don't have a hard and fast answer. Like, I've never seen a number that said, 35% or 80% of the population was literate, but I think that it was pretty intuitive for people to be able to read in that you did not really need to you didn't really need to memorize a bunch of abstract symbols like we do today. You could look at a simple thing like this and go, you know, yellow paper teeth,
But
Amascotlan.
do they have access to the materials to write it?
So there was a dedicated class of scribes, and this was a fairly high court position. So your average, farmer or shopsperson or slave probably didn't do a lot of writing. They probably didn't have access to, brushes and paper readily. They weren't going to just like keep a diary or make a shopping list or something like that. But I think given this, they would be able to suss out basically what it was saying if they somehow came across it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yep. Now, so I've thrown a lot of glyphs at you, and and now just to kind of tie everything together, they were sometimes used to make entire sentences. Now, this wasn't very common. We mostly see these in a few chronicle books, as we would consider them. So this one says, at Tenochtitlan, a fire was drilled at the Great Temple in the year of 8 Reed. So this glyph right here is Tenochtitlan, what we now call Mexico City. And we have its symbol was a cactus growing out of a stone, which is still a part of Mexico's national emblem today. A fire was drilled. We see a fire being created here at the Great Temple in the year 8 Reed. So you can read this up and get a full semantic sentence out of it. And a fire was drilled. Fire drilling was a big ceremony that happened every, I think, 52 or 54 years when those two calendars I mentioned lined up. So this was an extremely important calendar date that they were celebrating. For this one says Tenochtitlan took captives during the war with Acatzinco in the year 13 Rabbit. So once again, we have the sign for Tenochtitlan. We have a guy being taken captive. We have a war sign. This is Acatzinco, which meant place of the turquoise trees. And we have the year 13 Rabbit. So, you can tie this all together to make something more complicated than just a name or, a city place or something like that. And I think this is sort of the highest expression of glyphic writing that we see before the Spanish conquest are these chronicles. So
Are,
yes.
are we always gonna go from bottom to bottom up, or do they have different directions?
So for the chronicles I'm pulling them through, you usually see them going like this because they end with a date, but they could honestly go whatever direction makes sense for the layout of the page and whatever looks good. So
Okay.
I wouldn't say they have to be like this.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So my personal favorite fact about Aztec writing is that when the Spanish showed up, they brought an entire symbolic approach to them and how they represented like the names of holy people. So, very famously, for instance, the Virgin Mary was represented in Catholic artwork with a crown of heaven. Um, St. Peter or, San Pablo had a sword. San Sebastian had an arrow because according to his, story, he was killed he was shot to death with arrows. So when the Spanish showed up and conquered and took over, and they had this, this whole symbology about saint names, the Aztecs looked at that and they adopted it because it made sense. It fit into their way of doing things. So we see Catholic saint names used as name signs. And there is again a very rich and fun tradition you can do out of this if you're ever in a situation where you're writing a Nahuatl. Um, you know, San Domingo, St. Dominic has a dog holding a torch, for instance, and that would be fun to draw. You know, St. Agnes, Santa Ines has a lamb on a Bible. There's a lot you can do here. Sometimes they would write the Spanish names phonetically, which didn't always really fit in the sounds of Nahuatl, but they made them work. So Francisco was Cicico. We have a seashell and a jug. Or Esteban was Itzapan, salt and flag. Um, or Ana, we see women in Nahuatl means to grasp something, so we see a fist and it's holding water to remind us of that A sound. Now, of course, this wasn't just at writing names. We do have a small but very neat library of what are called the Testerian Catechisms. So, for those of you who don't have a lot of experience with Catholicism, a catechism is, the major documents or major creeds of Catholicism. And when you're studying to be a Catholic, either because you're a child or you're converting, you study these fairly extensively, as I understand. And these are things like the Lord's Prayer, Ave Maria, the Apostles' Creed. These are the things that you need to know and memorize to be a good Catholic, or at least an educated Catholic, I suppose. And so we have these books that are the catechisms written in glyphic writing. Um, and so how these work, we believe, is you would give these, the priest would give these to one of the Nawa speakers, and they would be able to look at this and recognize what's going on, and they would be able to recite the catechism from it. And now, a lot of times they had to make up their own signs for these. They had to get very creative. So here's one from the Egerton Codex, Our Father. And so we have like a Catholic priest, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And we see um, one of like the symbols that represents Jesus Christ here in Re to represent the name. So our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. A Nawa speaker could look at this and, read it out, and suddenly they are being a good Catholic. They are reciting the catechism. And we have, we have at least a few of these. We know this was a decently widespread practice, at least until Spanish literacy became more widespread. And also, as to your question of how much could an average person understand it, I would say decently well if you could just hand these to your random, neophyte initiate and they could figure out what they were reading. All right, this is the end of my section on the writing system itself. Now we're moving on to tools of the trade. So a lot of the information I have comes from a master's thesis written by a scholar named Ludo Snyders at the University of Leiden. It's called the Mesoamerican Codex Reentangled, Production, Use, and Reuse of Pre-Colonial Documents. And it has been amazing because this man did all of the cool stuff that we wish we could do, but he had university funding, so he could actually do it. So first of all, let's talk about grounds or writing surface. We do see some codices that were written on deer leather parchment, but far more commonly they were made on what's called amate or bark paper. These were made from various ficus trees. You boil it in ash and lime, and instead of paper making in most of the rest of the world where you shred the fibers and then you put it in a water suspension and then you pull it out with, a molten decal. They actually just took the strips and wove them together to make like a large flat piece of bark paper. This Now there's some people would say this isn't real paper because it wasn't made with a molten decal, but it's a writing surface. And one second. I actually have a piece of it right. Okay, you're all going to see my extremely messy office real quick. So I actually have a piece of a mate here so you can see what it looks like. It looks like bark. And so what they would do is they would take this paper and they would cover it with gesso, which is a mixture of gypsum and glue. And this would create a smooth, flat, even writing surface. We think they either used rabbit glue or they would make a orchid glue from various orchid bulbs, mostly Blevia and Govina species. You would cut the bulb into small pieces, dry it out. You would pound it together, and then mix it with whatever to make to make a glue. Now, Ludo Snyder's in his document recreated it using potato starch because you know orchid bulbs are expensive and just grinding up a bunch of them to make glue would be expensive. So apparently potato starch works in a pinch. Now, we don't really know a lot about what tools they used. That wasn't something they really wrote about, and it's not something we have a lot of surviving, artifacts of. But based on both pictorial and reconstructive evidence, we believe that first of all, they had rabbit hair brushes. Again, rabbits were common and easy enough to get their hands on. We believe they had reed pens, somewhat similar to bamboo pens we'll see today sometimes. We know they used feathers, though interesting, instead of using the quill, we believe they used the veins, or, the fluffy part, to paint with to get like soft, even lines with. There's other tools that might have been used, especially for murals, but we think they were mostly using, reed pens, feathers, possibly rabbit brushes. They were using what they had on hand in the middle of Mesoamerica. And a lot of their color molding was done with a molcajete or a metate. And now these are still used in Mexico today, especially for grinding, like grinding up corn to make masa. And these are usually made of like a smooth volcanic rock, and the more you use it, the smoother the volcanic rock gets. We actually have one at home that we still use for making salsas and whatnot, so you can actually get a molcajete pretty easily at like most big Mexican stores. The metates, the big grinding stones, are a little bit harder to get your hands on, and probably even harder to transport. So for blue, the main thing they used was Maya blue. This was a mixture of añil indigo, specifically what's called like Mexican indigo or Mayan indigo, Paligorskite, which is a type of clay, and copal, which is a resin, sort of like a pre-stage of amber. Now, we don't actually know exactly how it was made to this day. It's one of those historical mysteries. Some people claim they've reconstructed the recipe, but we still don't know exactly how they got these really bright, vibrant blues that they got. They also used comolina flowers for blue as well, though Maya blue we think was the big one they used. For yellow, they sometimes used what it's in English it's called dodder, a type of parasitic tree vine. They used achiote, which is a like spice ball, as I mentioned, comes from the annatto shrub. They had orpiment. They had yellow ochre, which were used in European traditions as well. Generally, don't recommend working with orpiment. It's not a very safe one to use. And my wife and I have actually experimented with achiote and using marigold flowers, and both have made very pretty yellows before. We've also tried making Maya blue. That was a bit more difficult, and my wife almost blew up the house. That's a different story, though. Um, for for black, we believe most likely they used lamp black. Oh yes, thank you for that, Carla. Yes, specifically Indigo Farah. Sufriticosa, I couldn't remember the exact name off the top of my head, and Indigofera guatemalensis. Yes. And they are also surprisingly hard to find, at least in the United States. So for black, they mostly used lamp black. This is just paint made from the soot that, you know, collects on the underside of cooking vessels or above, candles and lanterns, things like that. The interesting thing for all you pigment nerds out there is that Aztec lampblack is almost, as far as I know, entirely plant-based. In other parts of the world, they would burn bones to make black ink. We do not see that in Latin American samples. At least that exists down to this day. They also had a form of iron gall ink made from a fruit called the nacascolot. Um, with and yeah, so they would mix that with various things, and they would make a writing ink, and just a nice solid dark ink similar to iron gall chemically, from what I understand. And so that also gives options if you're trying to do more of the writing, less of the drawing parts of things. So for red, very famously, they used cochineal, um, which is made from small red bugs that grow on cactuses. Well, they live on cactuses. We believe they also used other red plants, so we still know exactly what. They had red ochre and cinnabar, though we don't see those as much in painting. It's mostly cochineal. And I mean, cochineal is a famously beautiful and vibrant red, so I can believe that they didn't think they needed other color, other sources very often. We in the codices we see cochineal being given as a tribute. We see cochineal harvesting in the Florentine Codex. So this was once again an extremely important, trade good, tribute good. Um, just again a very integral part of their process. Now, those are the main colors we see. We see green, but we think that was mostly made by mixing blue and yellow. And green is famously a hard color to make, at least color fast green in most parts of the world. Pink and gray were just diluted red and black, we believe. Usually for white, they just would leave the paper blank. We believe also sometimes white ochre would be used, or now we don't see a lot of purple. I've seen some speculation they might have had Tyrian purple. That type of Snell, or at least a related one, is found in the Gulf of Mexico, but it is not one that comes up very often. Any questions about all of the pigments before we move forward? Fantastic. So, of course, some of your scribes and scribes want to make pretty scrolls. I understand. So here is some advice on translating scrolls. So this is my silver oak. If for those of you not in the Middle Kingdom, this is an award given out for excellence in science and research in the Middle Kingdom. Um, and I actually got mine because during COVID, I fell down a rabbit hole researching Aztec shield designs. And then the heralds told me I couldn't register an Aztec shield as a heraldry. So I fell deeper. Then I registered a shield as Aztec heraldry. And then I've just been sliding down this path ever since. So this is my scroll, and I looked at it and done, and I, what's the important information? You need to know where it was given out. You need to know who it was given out to, and the Nahuatl name that I've registered in the society is Chimalpapech, or Shield Mender. Um, so this one was given out by Their Majesties Felix and Magdalena. So I was like, okay, Felix sounds like Pielish, which you could show as a weeple or a blouse and the sign for face. For Magdalena in Catholic symbology, she's, Mary Magdalene is represented by a holy oil vessel. And I looked up the date. It was, the year of 9 Gali, or 9 House. And this was at an event called Baroness Wars, or the War of Noble Women. So I sat down and kind of figured out what would this look like as a scroll, and I just sort of sketched everything out. So, have a symbol representing me, represented, engage in research. I go to the Shire of Swordcliffe at the event of two noble women fighting. I actually have the wrong king and queen here. I got my dates wrong when I was first doing this, but we have the king and queen giving me the Silver Oak Award, and then we have the date on the side. I put in some glyphs to kind of show what everything would look like. I have no artistic talent, so I gave it to my lovely wife, and she drew out a rough idea of what a scroll for my Silver Oak would look like. And my favorite part about the story is I was teaching this class at Known Worlds, Heralds and Scribes, and about at this point, the scribe who drew this, who did the scroll, Saraswati, walks in and she's like, "That's my work. I did that." I'm like, "You did," and here it is in Nahuatl. So this is about what a Aztec scroll might look like. We have the date. We have me doing research, me going to Swordcliffe at the War of the Noble Women, and being given Silver Oak by Pielish and Magdalena. And we even have a sign representing me, my little Aztec shield. Now, since I first taught this class, a friend of mine, a friend of mine also in the Middle Kingdom, Ragna, decided to do a actual Aztec scroll for somebody who was graduating page school. So know that for prowess in teaching the arts, Marshall does Jonathan von Glayer advance to the level of a scholar page. So this is during the date was 3 Crocodile. We see him fighting, we see him teaching, we see him going to the Barony of Phoenix, which we decided to draw as a bird rising out of fire because the phoenix. We have for Royal University, this is a school wearing a crown, which I think looks cool and is also, royal school. Now, this young general also really liked the name Iron Jaguar, so we see a jaguar with an iron axe. Um, the the teacher who gave it to him was a gentle named Elizabeth Alice. So the sign for Elizabeth is a basket of bread for Saint Elizabeth. So we drew a basket of tamales. And then we have a roll of amate, literally a page for the page scroll that he got. So this is, an actual scroll written in glyphs and what it would look like. All right, that's the class. What further questions do people have?
I just have to say that this is fantastic. Thank you.
I'm glad to hear. I'm glad you liked it. And I will post my notes below, or I'll post them in the chat. So that's not the Aztec scribal notes I'm looking for, but yeah, I'll post the notes. They have links to some interesting documentation. Including the database I briefly showed where I was getting where I was pulling Aztec glyphs.
Are we going to have access to the presentation?
Yes,
Thank you.
yes, my notes are in the presentation.
Okay. Thank
Here
you.
it is. Useful links for Aztec projects. And so this includes links to the classes I teach, a pronunciation guide for Nahuatl written by a gentleman named Tenoch Kakwikwat, a website I mentioned where you can look up what the sign is for any particular day. Apparently um today is 5 Eagle in the year of 13 house. Um I have a database of glyphs where somebody give me the first thing that comes to your mind.
Weaving.
All right, let's see what we get. So we have, chose a woven mat. Um, apparently this is excrement on a floor mat. That's a choice. But or let's say rabbit, and it shows us rabbits. I use this all the time when I'm planning out glyphs. Um, there is a dictionary of Nahuatl and some other just useful links, including some academic ones. There's actually a giant feud in Aztec deciphering between Alfonso Lacadena and Gordon Whitaker, which is great if you like academic drama. And yep. And here's oh wait, I already linked to that. Never mind. Oh, now you have it twice. All right. Fantastic. That's the class.
When are you going to teach the other classes that you have here?
Um, so I've talked with Yzma, and she knows what I teach. She knows she knows that I will teach whenever she asks me to. We've talked about in June or July me possibly teaching a class on documenting from oral traditions. But so that's probably the next one I'll teach. And in addition, my Aztec name and heraldry class is on YouTube, and I will add that into this document.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yep, sure thing.
All right, I am going to cut in real quick just to answer a couple of the questions that are in the chat that are relevant to the upcoming classes. I am just confirming what we are going to have next month for the lecture series. I have a couple of people that I'm talking with that we're trying to get scheduled and organized. But the best way to keep in touch with our projects generally, there is a Facebook group called SCA New World Personas Unofficial. That is like the headquarters of all these projects. Of course, I will try to get this information out on all of the other regular SCA Kingdom pages as well. I am also putting together a email blast list for those who are preferring not to use Facebook as their primary way of communicating. And if you'd like, you can absolutely leave your email address in the chat, and I will collect those email addresses at the end and just add you to the email blast list for upcoming classes and publication links for YouTube videos for anything that we are adding to our list. I do not know what we're teaching in or what we're having in May. I have two people who I'm trying to get scheduled, but I will get that information out as soon as it is available. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for teaching. I appreciate you every single time. All of your classes are fantastic.
Thanks. I love teaching them. Thank you again for asking me. Also, there is a unofficial Discord. It's not terribly active, but it is a good group of people that do there's like that cover new world topics. You're all invited.
And I'll try to collect all of these links and various things as well and put them in the Facebook event for this, and then also I'll send out a kind of summary blast to the email list once we get it going. so that everyone has access to all of the different I see a bunch of people joining the Discord
Right?
server. It is a really fun place, so I hope everybody enjoys that space you've made.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions either for our instructor or about upcoming lecture series? If not, we'll start to kind of wind down and close out the recording.